I'm driving in my car. I'm on my way to work. It's about 8 o'clock. I'm stuck in traffic. I'm running late, as usual. And I get a call from an unknown number. I don't know why, on this particular day, I decided it would be a good idea to answer. And before I know it, I'm in the middle of telling this complete stranger my whole life story. How lately, I'd been feeling a little disconnected from my friends, my family. Things that I used to be passionate about were just no longer holding my attention. How the anxiety that had started in college had given way to full-blown panic attacks. I was now avoiding things like public transportation and large crowds. How the alcohol use that had started around the same time was now more of a lifestyle. I was drinking myself to sleep most nights, a little bit more on the weekends. What I had forgotten was a couple days earlier, my mental health had hit an all-time low, and I was cold calling therapists in my area seeking services. So unbeknownst to me, my new therapist was on the other end of the phone. And she said to me in a very calm but stern way, the way that therapists talk to their clients, she said, "Tom, I think that you're an alcoholic." And I said, "Screw this lady." And I hung up. But as my day went on, I started to think, you know what, she might be right. I do drink quite a bit, and at this point I'm desperate. So I call her back, I tell her, all right, I'm ready to work with you. She says, "Great, take yourself to a 12-step meeting, call me next week." God damn it, all right. So off I go, on my way to my first 12-step meeting, determined to prove to this complete stranger that I'm not an alcoholic, I'm just broken, and she's supposed to fix me. And I learned a couple of really interesting things. The first thing I learned is that I am definitely, by the book definition, an alcoholic. I thought somehow this woman had staged people in this room to tell me my story exactly back to me. I was like, who is this? Who is this person? How do you even know where I am? And the second thing I learned is that I was not alone. In fact, most people that I meet in recovery felt the exact same way that I did. The problem was not our substance of choice. The problem started long before that. The problem was here. Now, I'm not here to talk to you about the efficacy of 12-step programming and talk therapy when it comes to addiction treatment, but I will say if you're struggling, please talk to somebody. It does get better. It's the best thing I've ever done in my life. No, what I'm here to talk to you about is the field of epigenetics. Why are we talking about genetics? What you don't know about me is that I'm a social worker. I work with children and family involved in the child welfare system. And in social work school and along our careers, we learn very clearly that increased levels of stress, especially early in our lives, lead to higher instances of mental health crisis, substance use, and violent crime later in life. This is social work and psychology 101, right? A good example of this is low-income communities. Low income, high stress, higher instances of mental health issues, substance use, violent crime. Now, our society is incredibly good at pathologizing and medicating these issues, also criminalizing these issues, but that's a talk for another day. No, this left me with a really big question. What about me? Why was it that I was facing a mental health crisis? I never had identified as having any abnormal stress in my life. I didn't have childhood trauma. In fact, I think I had it pretty good. And this is what led me to the field of epigenetics. And epigenetics is the study of how our environments can impact our genes. Because in social work, we have a saying, which is that when it comes to mental health crisis, it's our genetics that load the gun, and it's our environment that pulls the trigger. This is no longer a conversation of nature versus nurture. This is yes and both. So a study that was published in 2014 followed a family of mice. And what they did is they removed these baby mice from their mother for just a couple hours a day for weeks at a time. Now, mice, very much like humans, need close familial contact at a young age. And not surprisingly, these baby mice, as they developed into adult mice, began to show symptoms of neurosis. They were displaying neurotic behavior. This goes back to what we know about social work. High levels of stress, especially early in our lives, lead to later instances of mental health crisis later. This is something we might call in humans post-traumatic stress disorder. But this is where the study gets really interesting. Because they followed those baby mice. And they studied the offspring of those mice. And those baby mice also displayed the same neurotic behaviors as their parents did. And then the offspring of those mice also displayed the same neurotic behaviors that their parents and grandparents did. This went on for 3 generations, 3 times removed from the initial stressful trigger. And the study goes on to talk about mRNA sequencing and other things that, as a social worker, I'll admit I don't understand. But it really got me thinking. I don't know about you, but I didn't have to go very far back in my family history to find significant instances of trauma. This is across the board on both sides of my family, but there's one story in particular that I think is important to share with you. My grandfather served in World War II when he was 18 years old. And he passed away just last year at 100 years old. And before he died, he wrote me a letter. In this letter, he wrote about his experience in World War II. Something that happened to this man 80 years before he died was one of the most important things that he could think to communicate to his grandson. It's no secret in my family that this man was plagued with symptoms of post-traumatic stress, except that when he came back, post-traumatic stress was not a diagnosis that you could have. The more I got to know about him, the more I realized this man is just like me. This inability to form close emotional relationships, this inability to slow down or stop, this fear that if you ever let your guard down, something terrible might happen. But then what happened after World War II? After World War II, things were pretty good. Business was booming. People were having children. The baby boomer generation, the largest generation we had ever seen. I think it's safe to say that this is a generation of Americans who was born to parents with increased levels of stress. But then what happened in their lives? Things like the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King assassination, JFK, the Challenger explosion, the Vietnam War. To boot, with the increase in television and radio news programming, you no longer had to experience the stress firsthand. Now you could be impacted by stressful events simply by being at home. What if we fast forward to my generation? I remember being in school and hearing about 9/11. I remember hearing about Columbine. I remember hearing about Hurricane Katrina. What about kids now? What about Sandy Hook? What about Las Vegas? What about Pulse nightclub? What about COVID-19? Right now in America, we're facing the largest mental health epidemic that we have ever seen. Rates of suicide, of substance use, of overdose, of violent crime are higher than they've ever been. 1 in 4 American adults is diagnosed and treated for mental health. If you qualify for Medicaid, that number doubles. I do not believe that we're facing a mental health crisis. I believe what we're facing is a collective traumatic response. We are generation after generation of Americans genetically predisposed to high levels of stress, living in a time of unprecedented levels of stress. If you think something might be wrong, you're probably right. Not only is it okay to not be okay, at this point in American history, it is downright normal. But we can't heal until we get honest with ourselves. That's the first step in any program of recovery, admitting that we have a problem. If you take one thing from this talk today, please understand that any of these regular diagnoses that have become so common in American culture can exist on a spectrum. It's very possible to be a little bit anxious, a little bit depressed, a little bit addicted. It's time that we get honest about this and start healing, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. Because while we may not be responsible for what happened before we got here, we are absolutely responsible for what happens next. Thank you.